Welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Tuesday, March 24th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Jacob, how are you?
I'm great, Jessica. How are you? Hopefully you're staying sort of safe.
Yeah, it's we had an alert at 1 a.m., but I was already half asleep, so that's a good way to go into these things. It has been another night, though, of Iranian missile attacks, including in central Israel, Hezbollah strikes in northern Israel, which really has not let up at all, and Iranian strikes in southern Israel, including in the last, 15 minutes. There was damage to a home in Haifa in the early hours of Tuesday morning. In other words, another night of strikes, despite or in spite of the news that we're talking about today. Jacob will fill us in on that. We will talk about the latest from Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump's bombshell claims that there is a deal in the works with Iran to end the war, that it's very close, that Israel, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be very pleased with the terms of the deal. We have reactions from the Prime Minister. But Jacob's also done a good bit of reporting about how the Gulf states are reacting to the war and what they think about that right now. So we'll hear about that. Also some analysis on the Iranian nuclear program and where they might be sitting with all of that right now. And something we haven't talked about a lot in the last 2 to 3 weeks, the Hamas disarmament program and what's happening with that. So stay with us. Okay, so Jacob, really this unexpected announcement from President Trump on Monday, first on social media, where he says there have been ongoing talks. Iran, of course, has denied those talks. Prime Minister Netanyahu gives a very upbeat video statement on Monday night about this. Again, very unexpected. Take us through this. From when you first noted that this announcement was being made on social media, had you heard about it even prior to that? Tell us what you got.
I can't say when it comes to President Trump that I've been able to predict every which move that he's made. But I would say after the fact, you can put a lot of rationale into this decision. Because basically, if you recall, at this point, a little bit over 48 hours ago, he had put out this ultimatum saying that he was going to strike Iran's energy sites if it didn't reopen or allow the passage of all the ships that are kind of stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. And as that deadline, which was for Monday night at this point, approaching, I don't want to say cold feet, but I think there was a recognition that maybe right now this isn't the greatest idea to immediately start blowing up all of Iran's energy sites, just because if the goal here is not to turn Iran into a failed state, at least that's how the U.S. sees it. I think they want Iran to be, maybe you could say, a flexible state, one that's willing to work with the U.S. And if you bomb all their energy sites, it's much more likely to see the former, that this becomes a failed state. So what this does is Trump announces at, I think it was 7 a.m. local time, for President Trump, that he is actually going to be giving 5 more days before he maybe follows through with this ultimatum. And during that time, there will be negotiations, because actually over the past 48 hours, he says basically there's been real progress towards a possible agreement that will end the war. So that was what, I guess, started a flood of questions of what exactly is he talking about. And he, I guess, tried to explain that to reporters who asked him quite a few questions about it a couple of hours after he posted this Truth Social message.
Okay. I mean, just let's go back to Straits of Hormuz a little bit, because that really has emerged as it seemed, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, that this was going to be the next front, in a sense, that was going to keep this war going, possibly for several more weeks even. What else are you hearing about as you speak to sources, as you sort of look at this ongoing development in this war that is in its 4th week?
Right. As you mentioned, this is where the war has shifted to this strait, and there's a recognition in Washington that it can't be ended until the U.S. has either control of the Strait of Hormuz, or that Iran simply opens it to back how it was before. That that there's no way to end the war without that happening. I think that probably played a role in the decision to give some more time here, that basically a lot of Trump's calculus is based off of the markets right now, and specifically prices of oil, which have been skyrocketing over the past couple weeks. And what we saw is immediately after Trump made this announcement that they dropped very quickly back down below $100 a barrel, which was something that we hadn't seen for a few days. They did go slightly back up to 101 later in the day, but it was still a pretty significant drop. And it was clear that I think Trump recognizes that the more he can talk about the possibility of this war ending, the more likely it is for markets to remain relatively calm. And he talked about his decision even to give sanctions relief as well for Iranian oil, which is something he lambasted the Obama and Biden administrations for doing the exact same thing. That was in the context of negotiations that were happening with Iran towards a diplomatic deal, not in the context of a war. And what Trump basically says is that we needed to lubricate the system by giving this, allowing this oil to be entered into the market. And we don't even really know if that sanctions relief will be felt by Iran. I think even if Iran isn't able to access the funds themselves, money is also fungible in some ways, and they might be able to get other things in exchange for this oil, even if it's not the 14 billion that we're talking about if you factor into inflation.
Okay, so we have the bombshell announcement. We have the reasons behind it. What is actually happening now that this announcement is out there and that these talks are happening, and what are we going to be expecting to see over the next couple of days?
Right. So I think what gave Trump the opening to walk back from this ultimatum, or at least extend it a little bit longer for 5 more days, is that there were talks that took place over the weekend, mainly through mediators. Basically, we had 3 countries: Pakistan, which is one that we haven't necessarily heard of in this context in terms of playing mediator, but also Turkey and Egypt. And my understanding, speaking to a couple Arab diplomats, that Pakistan is the main actually mediator in this case, that Trump has a very good relationship with their military chief, that Pakistanis also have engagement and ties with the IRGC and border with Iran. So there's practical reasons why they can play an effective mediator. I think the U.S. is looking for someone instead of Oman after I feel like after there was a feeling that Oman did not play an effective role in the previous rounds of negotiations. So over the weekend, there was talks or efforts by the U.S. to try to see if there was someone in Iran that was credible that could possibly lead to a breakthrough. That there's someone that could maybe be able to work with the U.S. and someone who has legitimacy. And the idea was to look at the Speaker of Parliament, someone with the name of Ghalibaf, who is very close to the IRGC, but also someone who's been seen as an advisor to Ali Khamenei and also Mujtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, who hasn't been seen yet. And that my understanding was that there were messages that were passed along between the sides while they actually were very direct negotiations, that we were talking with this very senior Iranian leader. He was careful not to name Ghalibaf, but he does say that, or he claims that Iran had agreed to forego a nuclear weapon, something that they've claimed over and over again. On the other hand, they are enriching at numbers that wouldn't make any other sense unless they are trying to reach a weapon. But he also says that they've agreed to give up enrichment, and that they've agreed up to even give up their nuclear enriched uranium stockpiles. I don't think those were 3 things that they've actually agreed to do at this point. I think Trump is trying to just inject some life into these negotiations that haven't even happened in a serious manner. But what I think Pakistan is trying to do in the coming days is host in Islamabad the next round of talks with the Iranians and the U.S. I'm sure there would likely be direct and indirect components of those talks. But what we're seeing is likely there's going to be a new player involved. You asked who might it be, and I think it's JD Vance, the vice president. There's not a lot of trust from the Iranians in the U.S. negotiators in general, but particularly in Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. The way that they talked about the way that those previous rounds of negotiations went, the Iranians felt that Witkoff definitely particularly misrepresented the way the talks had unfolded, and therefore I think they're looking to have someone else also be part of the talks, and Vance presents, I think, a more suitable option for them, especially because he is seen, at least in the administration, as someone who is a little bit more willing to, or someone who is more interested in trying to end this war as opposed to expand it. I think he's seen as the more isolationist camp. Whether or not that's exactly true, but that's the perception, maybe one of the reasons why Iran wants him at the table. So those talks could possibly happen later this week. But what you also have is, because we're pushing back by 5 days, is that gives the U.S. more time to get more assets in the region. We've seen some reporting about several thousand Marines forces who are en route, and it's going to take some time. And at the earliest they could likely get to the Middle East would be around Friday, and that's around when this deadline would theoretically expire. There's talk of trying to take over this Karg Island, which is a main place of where Iran exports a lot of its oil. And therefore, if you get the Marines there in time, then you'll have a more credible threat to actually act on that ultimatum that President Trump has been talking about. But clearly, I think that there's more time to act on this threat that President Trump has been talking about.
Just one more thing about JD Vance, and he spoke with Netanyahu yesterday, which is also interesting, meaning this role that he seems to be taking now at this particular point in this war.
Yeah, I think it was noteworthy. I think President Trump also spoke with Netanyahu, so the two of them are playing a role here. This isn't totally foreign to JD Vance. He has been involved. He actually, if you recall, visited Israel earlier on when the focus of the Trump administration was more on Gaza. But he has been involved in the negotiations or the discussions that the Trump administration has been having about Iran. I think he actually, despite the perception, was supportive of taking this step, even if I think he wants to end this very quickly and is concerned about the possibility of the spilling over. But I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has seemed to have an okay relationship with him. There hasn't been reporting to suggest otherwise, as opposed to, I think, when you actually look at Steve Witkoff, there has been a bit of murmuring of Netanyahu's discomfort with him. So they did have this conversation to go over the potential deal that could be coming about. Notably, I actually spoke with an Israeli official on Monday who said that while, yes, the Israelis were aware of the possibility that there would be these negotiations, there was murmurings of this happening already over the weekend on Friday even. But what I was actually told is that they were caught off guard in Jerusalem by the specific announcement that President Trump made in the morning on Monday in the U.S., saying that we're going to be having these negotiations, that things are going so well, that they weren't given the specific details that this was really an option so quickly. And I think Netanyahu now is trying to, I want to say, spin it, but it doesn't want to be seen as coming off guard. And that's why I think he gave a very positive, as you called it, upbeat video statement, basically saying that the deal that could come about is as a result of the military pressure that we have been exerting on Iran over the past 3 weeks. And he tries to argue that whatever deal that the U.S. signs, it's going to safeguard our interests in Israel.
Okay, let's take a quick break, and when we're back, let's talk about the Gulf states, because you've been doing some writing about that, and let's hear what they are saying about all of this, about the war with Iran that they are now involved in. So stay with us. Jacob, you've been speaking to some sources from the Gulf states, and of course they have been involved in this war. There's been strikes on the Gulf states, and now they appear to be saying to you in this latest piece that you wrote that they don't necessarily want to look to end this war right away, that there are elements that are worthwhile carrying on with. So what are they actually thinking about at this point in time? Again, fourth week of the war.
Yeah, so I spoke with 4 different senior Gulf diplomats over the past few days from 4 separate countries to try to get a more holistic understanding of how the region views this. I think there's this assumption that there's this monolith, that all the Gulf states feel the same way about the war. That's definitely not the same thing. That's definitely not the case. But I did recognize that there's some consensus amongst at least a majority of them. We're talking about basically 6 different countries: the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman. And there was unanimity before the war that they did not want to see this happen. They felt that they would come under attack, as has been the case. Trump has argued that he's been totally surprised by this, but the Arab officials I spoke with were pretty adamant about this. They knew this was going to happen. Maybe there was a little bit of surprise at what they called the indiscriminate nature of the attacks, meaning not just that they attacked civilian sites. That was something that wasn't totally unexpected, but the fact that even countries like Azerbaijan and Turkey and Oman, which has helped mediate, I think the extent of this has just been everywhere that's been getting hit, is maybe a little bit surprising, but not completely. And because of this concern over the shattering of their MO of being this stable and secure zone in the region, that's been shattered by these attacks, and it could take a long time for businesses, international organizations to to regain their trust in Dubai and Doha and other places in the region that I think were banking on that trust for a long time. Um, and and that was, I think, why they were so concerned about this starting to begin with. What's been interesting in speaking to all these different officials is that there seems to be actually, despite that, a consensus that amongst most of them that actually this war does need to continue. That while we didn't support it from the get-go, once it's already happened, we feel that Iran needs to be degraded significantly so that that it thinks twice about carrying out these attacks against our countries again. Our anger is at Iran, and that we're not thrilled with the way that the U.S. has been handling this war, and Israel as well. I think there's a lot of definitely anger there. But there's a feeling right now that the focus needs to be on actually further degrading Iran, so it is unable to carry out these kinds of attacks again. And that's what they try to argue in different ways in this story that I get into.
Okay. So then what are they actually saying now? Here we are at this turning point possibly in the next 5 days or so. So what do they actually want to do going forward? What's
Yeah, it's a good.
their point there? Yeah.
It's a good question, and I tried to get an understanding of what sufficiently degrading Iran means. So one of the officials talked about, okay, they can't have any missiles left, they can't have any manufacturing sites. They want generational damage as opposed to just pushing it back a few years. That would be something that they would be able to live with. But then there was this recognition from other diplomats who I think were a little bit less gung ho. I think the UAE seems to be the most assertive in the need to strike Iran. And that seems to be why the UAE and Israel are aligned. But there was this recognition that even if we do strike, we don't expect regime change to take place. And therefore, eventually, Iran is likely going to try to regroup and rebuild whatever capacity that had been destroyed in this war. There are some questions, I would say, about the logic of trying to, if the goal is just to degrade Iran, what you're really accomplishing from a strategic level. But it was noteworthy nonetheless to just hear all these Arab officials say pretty clearly that we're not begging for the ceasefire that I think many of watchers of the region are maybe used to hearing a lot of these countries always calling for a de-escalation. Even if they're maybe talking, some of them are talking about that publicly. Privately, that's not necessarily the case, and that's been kind of interesting to hear. The other question I asked is whether there's anger at the U.S. and Israel for starting this war, given that they're facing the brunt of the attacks. If you think about it, it's the UAE actually that's facing the most Iranian drone and missile fire, much more so than Israel even, and other countries, and Qatar also, which has maintained a relatively good working relationship. Um, that they, yes, they're not thrilled with the way the war is necessarily being handled in terms of some of the lack of clarity that Trump is giving and the back and forth in some of his positions, but they were clear that the anger is mainly at Iran. Um, there is a willingness from the Abraham Accords countries, Bahrain and the UAE, to double down on their relationship with Israel as a result of this war. That the feeling is that when this war ends, we recognize that Israel is not our enemy, that Iran is. But as for the other countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, I think there's still frustration with Israel in the feeling that at least there's this perception that Israel dragged the U.S. into this war. That's what I was told by one Saudi official. And therefore, I think there's not a lot of appreciation for that. And there's concern about what Israel's doing in Lebanon. They recognize that Hezbollah is this major threat that needs to be degraded. But the feeling is that the way that Israel's going about doing it by also targeting civilian sites in Lebanon, and it's undermining the government there that they're really trying to prop up hard. If you think about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others that have been donating a lot of money and political capital to try to prop up this new government in Lebanon that is
They don't want to see
anti-Hezbollah.
it all blown away. Yeah.
Exactly. And of course, then there's the issues of what's happening in Gaza with just the blowback from the war there that I think these Arab diplomats haven't forgotten about, and then the ongoing or the uptick in settler violence in the West Bank, that there's a real anger that Israel's not cracking down on that. So all this to say, will they join the war? I think that was one thing I wanted to push them on, and I was told by one Arab official that one of the four that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are actually considering. It is kind of puzzling given how much money that these countries have put into by purchasing a lot of weapons from the U.S. and other countries to bulk up their military, and then now, out of all times, that they're under a repeated attack and they're not using it, so it's a little bit puzzling. But I think they're still very wary of what the Iranian response will be. We haven't seen the Houthis enter this military campaign yet, and the Saudis have a pretty bad history trying to clamp down on that threat, and therefore maybe they are still hesitant. They're willing to help out in the Strait of Hormuz, which is pretty noteworthy given that we haven't seen that response from Europe, and Trump's been quite uh, critical of that. They are saying we're willing to take part in some way. I don't know if it'll be actually providing military troops or if it'll be something that will only take place after the war is over. But it does seem that Trump seems to have more appreciation for how the Arabs are responding to the Strait of Hormuz crisis more so than allies in NATO.
Jacob, I just want to go back to one thing that you said earlier about, just to clarify, about the fact that the Gulf states are being hit harder than Israel. Take us through that a little bit, because that's something that I think does not necessarily get noticed as much.
Well, I think Iran is able to use the drones more effectively against its Gulf neighbors because it's not as far of a
The
distance.
proximity, right?
Proximity and the fact that they're much cheaper than the missiles, which they're also using against some of these Gulf states. But a lot of it has been with these drone strikes that have been. I think there was a desire initially to target the U.S. bases in these countries that they're hosting in the Gulf. But ultimately, those were cleared out pretty early in the war, and therefore Iran is left with less targets. And they're going to claim that they're not targeting these civilian areas, but it's very clear the fact that these airports are being hit in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha and other civilian sites, hotels, that these are pretty targeted at this point because there's a recognition, or at least in Iran, the feeling is, yes, this is going to burn our relationships with these countries, but we think that they are going to respond by pushing the U.S. to end the war. And what I found out in this piece is that strategy has really backfired because they're not pushing the U.S. to end the war. They're actually pushing the U.S. to continue the war and not stop until the job is finished. So that's what we're seeing from the Gulf. I think there's still a recognition in Iran that at the end of the day, these countries are still going to have to live with Iran at the end of the day. And their neighbors just by geography, and therefore, yes, we are burning our ties with them for the meantime, but eventually they'll come back and try to find a new solution where we can all live together. Now, I spoke to one Arab official who was pretty adamant that there's going to be no engagement with Iran from his country so long as there's not new leadership or a new approach from leadership where they come out and say we are not going to be targeting you again. I think there's been a lot of bad blood that's now been boiling up as a result of this war. It's going to take time to fix.
Before we leave the subject of Iran, which of course is a little bit difficult to leave these days, talk to us about your interview with Denis Citrinowicz, who headed the Iran branch of the IDF's intelligence division, correct? That was his role. But you really spoke very specifically with him about what Iran at this point in time can really do with its nuclear program.
I thought it was important to try to speak with Danny just because I think in Israeli media there's a lot of support for this war and a lot of trying to justify the decision that the U.S. and Israel took to launch it on February 28th. And there's lots of arguments that are very legitimate. What I don't think has necessarily been heard as much has been some of the arguments against having launched this Operation Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury, respectively, by the U.S. and Israel. So the main argument I would say he makes in this piece is that Iran, for decades or for the past 20 years or so, has made the decision, he argues, to be what's called a nuclear threshold state, which is to not actually go for a nuclear weapon, but always remain just a few steps away by enriching to the levels that it has, by creating the program that it has, if it wants to, that's the form of deterrence. That you had a fatwa, a religious ruling by Ali Khamenei around over 20 years ago saying that we are against the actual pursuit of nuclear weapons. We have no interest in actually obtaining one. But this still is a way to keep our adversaries at bay by having this program, at least if we need it at some point. If the fatwa is removed, But basically, this is the strategy to just try to be a threshold state. And what Danny Sintrynowicz argues in this piece is that now what the U.S. and Israel have done by carrying out these attacks, both last year and once again now, is to demonstrate to Iran that this strategy of trying to just be at the threshold is not an effective one because it didn't deter U.S. and Israeli attacks. And as a result, Iran has two choices left. One is to abandon the nuclear program completely, and the other is, of course, to rush towards a bomb. And he says that it's much more likely as a result of these strikes that Iran is now going to rush towards a bomb, because that is the only way if you look at other examples around the globe, that's been the surer way to prevent attacks is if you have this nuclear program that, especially given the fact that Iran is now looking for revenge, that the son of Ali Khamenei has lost so many of his family members. He's now in charge, and he's not likely to take the more pragmatic approach of just abandoning the program entirely. This is a very ideological regime that views enrichment of uranium as a national right, and therefore is not going to be likely to give up simply because the U.S. and Israel are squeezing it. And that's why he argues that there wasn't a lot of strategizing done by the U.S. and Israel in carrying out this attack, that didn't think this through, that didn't think that Mujtaba Khomeini would likely be named the next leader, that saw an opening for a tactical victory in the killing Ali Khamenei and all those other leaders on February 28th, but not necessarily a strategic one. And that's the argument he makes. I will say the counter is that this whole time Iran was trying to go for a nuclear bomb, that this threshold argument is actually just a cover, that they were trying to reach.
They were there. Mm-hmm.
They were basically very, very close to being there, and just needed a little bit more time. And had the U.S. not acted and Israel not acted, we wouldn't have been able to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear program. And then if you wait until after the fact, then what have you done? And that's, I guess, the main counter that you hear to the arguments that Sintrynowicz makes. There's this desire in Israel to try to find a military solution for every one of these problems, and he argues that it needs to be done also with diplomacy, that if you just focus on the military way, you'll get Hamas and Hezbollah scenarios where you think that you've completely destroyed them or a total victory, and then in fact that these threats are still there.
Very briefly, as we get to the end of this daily briefing, something that we have not spoken about a lot is the Hamas front in Gaza and this disarmament proposal that's finally out there, that really sort of gives some concrete steps about how to move forward with this. You want to just give us a few sentences about it, what we're looking at here?
So a week and a half ago, there were meetings that were held in Cairo between representatives from the Board of Peace, that body that's tasked with overseeing the post-war management of Gaza. Their Gaza High Representative Nikolai Mladenov and Aryeh Lightstone, a Trump advisor, were meeting with Hamas officials and actually submitted a proposal on behalf of the mediators to Hamas. This long talked about disarmament proposal that I think had been sidelined as a result of the war. But U.S. officials, at least those who focus on this issue, were adamant that they weren't going to just simply allow this to wait until after the Iran war is over. So they submitted this proposal. A lot of the details I think we had been writing about in Times of Israel before, that we're going to have a gradual disarmament framework. This wasn't going to be something that's going to be able to happen all at once. That we'll start with the light weapons. We'll start with the heavy weapons, and within 90 days, this proposal talks about the rockets, the rocket launchers, and maps of the tunnels, the tunnel network in Gaza, that being handed over to the mediators. And you'll have then, followed by that, a buyback program for the light weapons, either offering money, jobs, immunity to those who are willing to give it up. And you'll have the Palestinian police that will be part of this NCAG, the technocratic government, helping collect the weapons, and that those places where you'll do this geographically, starting with the south, and that those places that have given up all their weapons or the areas where the weapons have been handed over, there's demilitarized. Then you'll have the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, and the Gaza police of the NCAG move in and phase out the IDF. There's a lot of skepticism whether the IDF will be willing to, or the Israel will be willing to withdraw. There's a lot of skepticism that Hamas will actually be willing to accept even a gradual framework. I think there's one Arab diplomat said there's going to need to be a lot more pressure than there is right now, and the focus right now is in Iran. So it's unlikely to see that pressure come to bear right now. What we are expecting now is to see a Hamas response in the coming days. I think even this week, my understanding, speaking to these Arab diplomats involved in this, that it's likely going to be a counter offer, that it won't just simply be a no because that would anger the mediators, but it's obviously not just going to be a yes. There's going to be further discussions that will play out in the coming weeks.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob, for really just taking us through all of this. Iran, U.S., President Trump, JD Vance, Netanyahu a little bit, Gulf states, Trinowitz, and the nuclear capabilities of Iran and Hamas and Gaza. We appreciate all of it.
Thanks
you.
for bearing with me. Thanks, Jessica.
Absolutely. And thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by Ari Schlacht. Take care, be well, be safe, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
On Sunday, March 22nd, 2 large ballistic missiles slammed into the southern cities of Dimona and Iraq.
Whoa.
Together, over 175 people were injured, making this the largest mass casualty event of this war to date. The next morning, I traveled down to both impact sites to speak with Dean Elsdoon, the international spokesperson for the police, to get a better understanding of what happened. I'm Eli Katzhoff, video reporter for the Times of Israel.
What happened here last night?
So we got 2 barrages of Iranian ballistic missiles targeting once again our residential communities. The first one in Dimona and the second one here in Arad. The missile itself landed right in between these buildings, causing severe damage to the infrastructure. Upwards of 88 civilians, including children, were medically evacuated here.
Were there missile fragments let, like unexploded devices here in this area?
Here specifically, none of them were the missile itself exploded. You could see the result of the blast. But our first responders from the Israel police, specifically the EOD, the bomb squads, need to neutralize the fragments because they can contain acid and fuel from the ballistic missile that's still hazardous to breathe in, hazardous to touch. And so we need to clear that so the first responders can go inside of these buildings.
When you come to a scene like this, what are the things you're seeing here? Can you describe that to us?
So the initial stages are obviously chaos. People don't understand what's taking place. First responders are trying to gather the information, what's impacted. You have people who are initially missing, parents looking for their children. So we have to open up tents so that way we can organize all the information to come in clearly. Even though some of these buildings were under danger of collapsing, our first responders were rushing in, and slowly we start to paint a picture. What took place, who's missing, how many casualties, but our main focus is life-saving operations. Getting the civilians out of here and getting those that need medical treatment as quickly as possible to hospitals.
We had to pause the interview for a few moments as the area we were standing in was deemed unsafe due to the risk of the surrounding buildings possibly collapsing. We picked it up a few moments later next to a bombed-out bus across the street.
Could you tell me about the evacuations?
It's multifaceted. We have to then bring in buses here because these people have no home left. We need to find places for them. So here specifically in Arad, we got in touch with the municipality and we've set up locations in the Dead Sea and Jerusalem where now these families need to be evacuated to. But you saw the damage here. There's not really anything for them to take. So they're packing just a few clothes in a backpack, getting onto the bus, and they're going to be in these hotels for a while.
Do we know what happened to safe?
So here specifically, the safe room is underground with the protected shelters underneath the ground. Many people were able to go. I've spoken with some of the residents that said they felt the boom as if it was inside of the protected shelter with them. Obviously, we're talking about a very heavy warhead here, not a cluster missile like we've seen lately in Tel Aviv or other areas like Jerusalem. But there's no doubt that protected shelters are saving lives, whether it's the mamad, the safe room inside the house, or whether it's the protected shelter underneath ground or the public ones. We've seen time and time again that they're protecting lives.
There are a lot of people that were injured in this blast.
At the end of the day, we obviously need to conduct an assessment to see where people were standing. It's too early to tell you. We haven't spoken with the people. Many of them were medically evacuated to hospitals. We need to discuss with them where they were and everything. But the point of the matter is that you've seen the damage. There was no fatalities here in the initial response, which is a miracle in and of itself. And I think a huge factor in that has to do with people going down to their protected shelters.